Cabasso. I'm the Executive Director of the Western States Legal Foundation, which is a U.S. affiliate of the International Association of Lawyers Against Nuclear Arms. I'm also a founding mother of the Abolition 2000 Global Network to Eliminate Nuclear Weapons, which is the, yes, that's appropriate, which is the mother of the Peace and Planet Network, and I serve on I'm one of the co-conveners of the Peace and Planet Network, and I'm also a national co-convener of United for Peace and Justice. So I'd like to commend that first panel. That was just an excellent setup for our second panel, which I'm pretty excited about, which is called, what is it called? It's called Nuclear Arms: Causes, Effects, and Movements Against. And what we're going to do on this panel is to try to dig a little bit deeper to look not just at the common effects of all the oppressions that we've been talking about, and nuclear weapons, of course, but also try to uncover the common causes. We don't spend much time doing that. I want to start out by just reading a short quote to just try to illustrate what I'm talking about. This is something Jonathan Schell said. Global warming and nuclear war are two different ways that humanity, having grown powerful through science, through production, through population growth, threatens to undo the natural underpinnings of humans and all other life. Now, we these days hear a lot of talk about the catastrophic consequences of a nuclear war involving 100 nuclear weapons, which would lead to dramatic climate cooling, famines, and potentially 2 billion deaths over the next 10 years. So that's a way we can see the common effects of nuclear weapons and climate change. But that doesn't address the common causes of nuclear weapons and climate change. And that's what this panel is going to begin to take a look at, in an even broader context than that. So we have three very distinguished panelists, and I will introduce them each before they speak, but I will say who they are now. Sharon Dolev from the Israeli Disarmament Movement, Vincent Intondi, the author of African Americans Against the Bomb, and Andrew Lichterman, my colleague at Western States Legal Foundation. So let me start by introducing Sharon, who I'm very happy to call my good friend. Sharon is an Israeli human rights and peace activist. She's the founder and director of the Israeli Disarmament Movement. In recent years, Sharon worked as a disarmament campaigner and as the director of Greenpeace in Israel. With the Israeli Disarmament Movement, Sharon represents ICANN and other international disarmament organizations in Israel, and she also serves on the coordinating committee of the Abolition 2000 Global Network to Eliminate Nuclear Weapons. Please give a warm welcome to Sharon.
Thank you, Jackie. Jackie is also one of the reasons I managed to come here, because I was denied a visa to the US, but then Jackie sent them some letters that were very convincing, I guess. I'll try to make some connections. We'll start with the NPT. The NPT is a treaty that was very important for many states for many, many years, saying on one hand, no proliferation of nuclear weapons, those states allowed to continue and have nuclear weapons, but there's a commitment to disarm. And the third leg of the NPT says that they're encouraging, the big carrot is nuclear energy. Now, the NPT has stuck for many, many years in the same position. We are waiting for the nuclear armed states to say that they are willing to give a timeline to disarm, and it doesn't happen. Meanwhile, we can see what happens with nuclear energy, and yet nuclear energy is the big carrot. And in 1995, when the NPT came to kind of an end, or the end of its first period, because of the Arab states and the non-aligned movement, there was a decision made to have a nuclear free zone, nuclear weapon free zone in the Middle East. A great decision, but a hypocrite one, because, and not the only hypocrite decision by the NPT, but a hypocrite decision by the NPT, because it's very nice to say that the Middle East will be nuclear free zone when the only nuclear armed state, Israel, is not part of the NPT, and therefore the decisions of the NPT has nothing to do with Israel policies. The one good thing that happened from that is that there was a beginning of work towards a conference calling for a weapon of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East, meaning nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons and their means of delivery. Now that is a bit more progressive or better, because if we're thinking not just how to bash Israel, which is a great sport, but how to bring Israel to the table, it needs to be something that Israel also has something to gain, meaning not just that Israel gives up its nuclear, chemical and biological arsenals, according to foreign sources, but also Israel can have something to do or something to say about any chemical or biological programs that might be in other states. So that was the decision taken in 2010, and since then everybody met together. It was very nice. They achieved nothing. They couldn't even agree on an agenda. Not the only forum in the world that couldn't achieve an agenda, but here, again, they couldn't even achieve an agenda. Meanwhile, something much better happened. Civil society managed to bring states into what we are witnessing today, a nuclear ban treaty. And that's great. That's the best thing that we could have achieved. 10 years ago, people were laughing at us when we said that we will do it, right? It was a joke that we will bring the states to a nuclear ban negotiations. But not just that it's happening, it seems like it's a successful, and civil society is in the room. But there's, again, one tiny, tiny, tiny problem. The nuclear armed states are not there. It's just a small problem. And like most problems, we will find a way to bring them, because we're civil society, right? It's up to us. It's all up to us. So let's look at the nuclear armed states, what will bring them into the table, and what is the connection between this and environment and peace. I will focus, of course, on the Middle East, but I'll explain why I'm focusing on the whole Middle East and not just on Israel. We all know that the US will not disarm without Russia, right? It has to go together. We all know that India and Pakistan will have to do it together. What will Israel need in order to bring Israel into the table? Israel not just need the rest of the world or the rest of the nuclear armed states to say, yes, we're going for it. Israel needs a regional solution. Israel is a small state surrounded by Arab states, and I'm not saying it to defend Israel. We can talk later about how horrible Israel is, but right now we want something from Israel, right? We want Israel to join these talks. So for Israel, we need a regional solution. This regional solution could have been the talks. However, the talks so far have been done only by state representatives. The state representative of Israel and the state representative of the Arab states. And if you'll show me a state representative with goodwill, I'll be surprised, because Israel would like to keep the monopoly right as it is. And the Arab states, they don't really care about the Israeli arsenal, but it's much nicer to be able to bash Israel and to call Israel to join the NPT and disarm with no conditions and so on, when they know that it's not going to happen. So not very responsible behavior by those who are supposed to keep us safe. So again, it's up to us, civil society. What we've done is we took all the obstacles that the state said that are there, all the reasons that they say that it's impossible, that make it impossible to come up with a regional treaty. And as civil society, we decided to write a treaty, and very comprehensive treaty, and to show the methods and the ways that this can happen. A WMD, Weapons of Mass Destruction Free Zone in the Middle East. Now we are on the second stage. Now we're going to have roundtables. The first one will be hosted by Scotland, hopefully in November. and when we bring experts from the Middle East to solve all the tiny problems that still exist with this treaty. But really tiny problems, like consensus. I said tiny, but it is solvable. We're civil society, we're flexible, and we want to achieve it, so we will find it. Now let's talk about the Middle East. What's there now? Yes, Israel with weapons of mass destruction. You have ISIS in Syria with chemical weapons. But we have something even much worse, the NPT. Because the NPT promised states that will be part of the NPT help to get nuclear reactors for energy, right? And states made believe or become to believe that having nuclear technology makes them more prestige. So at least 4 states in the Middle East now are looking or are in the first steps to build nuclear reactors in the Middle East. Now what is in the Middle East? Shortage of water, drinking water, wars, missiles, non-state actors, everything that takes nuclear energy and makes it by far more dangerous. Not to mention that the Middle East does have a very strong need for energy. Very strong need for energy. So what we propose here is something that is much safer. We proposed that not just that these states, without peace first, will start sitting and negotiating on a treaty. They can take the treaty, they can change it, they can do whatever they like. It was just one proposal, one way. But what we propose is to start already bringing experts together. And what we also offer is to start collaborations on renewable energy, peaceful energy, energy that will not kill. It's like killing the aquifer, the water underneath, right? That's what this nuclear energy will do. So what we offer is already to start with these talks and start the collaboration to build partnerships between states that already talk to each other. And what we offer is for these experts to sit together, make this much better, and we like other states and other international organizations to look at this, join us in our international meetings to make this one better, and try to offer this to your own governments. Maybe they will adopt it, because we don't think that the Middle East states will adopt it first. So it's up to us, but it's also up to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sharon. And actually, Sharon went a few minutes short, so we'll have some time. That it was wrong. Anyway, we'll have an opportunity for you to ask questions. Our next speaker is Dr. Vincent Intondi, the coordinator for history and political science and an associate professor of history at the Tacoma Park Silver Spring campus. He holds a BA in economics from SUNY Potsdam in 1997, an MA in history from SUNY Oswego in 2003, and a PhD in history from American University 2009. His research interests include African American history, 20th century United States history, social history, and nuclear studies. Vincent is the director of research for the American University's Nuclear Studies Institute and has proposed the Center for Black Studies at Montgomery College. His articles frequently appear in the Huffington Post, and he is the author of what I think is a very important book, African Americans Against the Bomb, Nuclear Weapons, Colonialism, and the Black Freedom Movement, published by Stanford Unity Press. Vincent?
Thank you. Okay, so I think we're good.
Okay.
Cool. Thank you. Thanks for being here. It's nice to see everybody dry and our clothes all dry after yesterday. Thinking about what I want to talk about today and all the work that I do in DC, and at the same time, I wear multiple hats. So I'm directing a new Institute for Race and Justice at my school. I work with UCS, Peace Action, and so on and so forth. And one thing that always comes up is the word intersectionality. This has now become kind of the buzzword in a lot of these movements of how things are interrelated. And That, in a sense, is even how this book came about in my own career. For so long in my own career, my life revolved around civil rights, the Black Freedom Movement. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, atomic weapons, nuclear disarmament really wasn't on my radar until 2005 when I first went to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Meeting with atomic bomb survivors, especially Koko Tenemoto Kondo, hit me so hard that I then knew I had to combine these two passions of mine, eliminating racism and eliminating nuclear weapons, and that's what led to this research in this book. And I say that because the idea of intersectionality or movements being interrelated is not new. And this was especially the case in the Black community. When the atomic bomb was dropped in Hiroshima and then in Nagasaki, many in the Black community, of course nothing's monolithic, but many in the Black community immediately came out and connected the issue of nuclear weapons to their own struggle for freedom and equality, to race, to colonialism, to economics. In fact, it was Langston Hughes, who in 1945, the great Black poet and writer, who was one of the first in our country to come out and question Truman's own racism in the decision to use nuclear weapons, and of course he was right to do so. Truman isn't the most racist president, we probably have that now, but one of the most racist presidents in US history. The great Paul Robeson, who so many of my students have no idea who he is, it's tragic, but Paul Robeson, a year after the atomic bomb was dropped, in Madison Square Garden, speaking to 20,000 people, he was one of the first to come out and tie this issue to colonialism, asking the question of where did the United States get our uranium to make nuclear weapons? And the answer, of course, was the Belgian-controlled Congo and Africa. W.E.B. Du Bois, who had by then already was lionized in Japan, was also a vehement critic of Truman's decision. And a lot of the early critiques that we see in the Black community was because there was a connection with the non-white world, something very important because we're lacking that in many cases today. That in many in the Black community, they identified with the Japanese. They identified with non-white people around the world. Remember, it was the Japanese who came out publicly and said they were going to come to Ethiopia's aid when Mussolini said he was going to invade and the US was going to do nothing. There were many in the Black community that saw Japanese internment in this country and said, here's a group of people that committed no crime but were being put in concentration camps simply because of the color of their skin. This could happen to us. So part of this was already built in before the atomic bomb even happened. When there was the hydrogen bomb in 1952 created and there were threats of using it in Korea, again in the Black community, they were looking at this saying, no, we are not going to let another Hiroshima happen to non-white peoples around the world. We see it again in the 1960s, of course, when we repeatedly threatened to use nuclear weapons in Vietnam. Again, non-white peoples. And in the 1950s, there's so many things happening at the same time where you can see these connections happening. Right, especially in a pivotal year like 1955, where in the summer you have the heinous murder of Emmett Till. A few months later in December, Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat on the bus. But in that same year, we had the Bandung Conference in Indonesia, the first all-African Asian conference. And if you look at that platform, they were very clear that they were against white supremacy, colonialism, and nuclear weapons. At the same time, in the late 1950s, we see the French government wanting to be a world power and announcing they were going to test their first nuclear weapon. Where? In Africa, in the Sahara. You have Algeria going through the revolutionary movement. You have Ghana and Nkrumah gaining independence. And the people in Ghana worried about the nuclear fallout from that French test. So who was it that put that together and started that movement to try to stop the French? It was Bayard Rustin. Rustin, who had such a long body of activism in this country dating back to the 30s, another person forgotten, marginalized because he was gay. In the 1960s, it was not just Vietnam, but we of course see Martin Luther King Jr. and all of his statements as triple evils connecting these issues. And where did he learn so much of this from? His wife, of course, Coretta, a long-seasoned activist dating back to her days at Antioch College. It was King who was saying, what does it matter if we're integrating lunch counters and then not caring about the world in which we're trying to integrate? Don't you see how these things are connected? And of course, this lasts into the 70s and the 80s. And I'm a historian that doesn't believe in just studying history and leaving it in the past. What good is that? If you're not going to study it and see how it can apply today, how can it reach students today? So the new book I'm writing now is on the June 12th, 1982 march. How? How did we get 1 million people together without a cell phone, without social media? What was done right? What was done wrong? How did they organize? How did this happen? And as I'm doing the research now in the interviews, I'm seeing some of the same themes that are happening. Some of the same problems that happened today, we saw that they had to fight back then. And this issue of intersectionality was there. Yes, there were some that said it should be a single issue. We should only focus on nuclear disarmament. But there were others, many others, including some in this very room, that said, how? How, when we look at the issue in Lebanon right now, when we look at the Reagan administration killing 75,000 in El Salvador with death squads, how can we not tie this together with what is happening with nuclear weapons? These issues are indeed connected. You know, one thing, the reason I wrote the first book was because right now, where I teach at Montgomery College, we're one of the most diverse schools in the country. And in my classes, about 50% of my students are from all various parts of Africa: Ghana, Ethiopia, Nigeria. 49% are African American from the DC area, 1% other. And what I see is a huge disconnect between my African and African American students. My African students tell me that when they come here, they are taught not to associate with African Americans, that they are lazy, they droop their pants, they're not one of you. My African American students will say, I'm not from Africa, I'm from Anacostia, I'm from Shaw, I'm from Southeast DC. And trying to explain to them, when the cops killed Philando Castile, they didn't stop first and say, are you from Anacostia or Nigeria? They killed him because he was black. And how these things are related. And we're starting to see that in certain aspects, right? We're starting to see now Black Lives Matter activists standing at Standing Rock. We're starting to see them stand with one another with Palestine or with Dreamers. But still nuclear disarmament isn't there. Still peace is not there. It's like the stepchild, the person left out of intersectionality. And why is that? What is it that we should be doing better? What can we do better? And that's what I'm looking at more and more today in this research and working with students today, working whether it's with Black Lives Matter or with peace groups and nuclear disarmament. And we have to be honest with ourselves. You know, being in DC, I'm privy to a lot of the problems that we saw back in the 80s and that we still see and are some ways worse today. And what I mean by that is there's a real disconnect right now between arms control and nuclear disarmament. We have to be honest, there's some people in the arms control movement that have a nice paycheck right now, and it's not in their best interest for us to have nuclear disarmament. And the tragedy is they're the ones that have the purse strings. They're the ones that have the money. And in many cases, it intersects with patriarchy. We have to be honest with ourselves that in a lot of this movement, there is still dominated by white men. And women are still fighting for a seat at the table. People of color are still fighting for a seat at the table, and most of all, millennials are fighting for a seat at that table. I am amazed every day at what somebody like Kate Alexander does for peace action on a shoestring budget. Imagine what she would do if she had the money that some of these larger think tanks have to really organize students. This young female just came up here from Tufts. Imagine what she could do with real resources. This is something that we have to address and we have to look at. We have to think about how can we reach these groups? How do we build coalitions of Black Lives Matter? Half of the battle is just showing up, just listening, right? And if they see that we're constantly there, then they'll be there for us, seeing how these things are interconnected. You know, the first book I wrote is because I'm hoping that if white peace activists that didn't know African Americans were interested in this pick up my book, they'll see the connections, and vice versa. That my African American students, when they'll see that Huey Newton and Angela Davis and Malcolm and so many others that they look up to actually cared about nuclear weapons, they'll get invested in it. And so, you know, in closing, yes, we are fighting on a lot of fronts, and that's a problem for a lot of my students. They're trying to put food on the table, pay student loans, hope to God they don't get killed by the police on the way home from school. And to them, nuclear weapons is still abstract. They've grown up with war. They were 2 years old when 9/11 happened. They don't know a world without it. And so they're just trying to survive. And so we have to work to see how can we get them to care about this issue. Is it that we need to rebrand peace, right? And make them realize that peace isn't weak? Do we have to show how it's connected, nuclear testing and environmental racism? These are the questions we have to ask ourselves. And so in closing is, yes, we have to fight for LGBT rights, we have to fight for women's rights, we have to fight for Black Lives Matter, for Native Americans. But as Dr. King said, what does it matter if we achieve social justice if we're all dead from nuclear war? And now is the time. Now is when we capitalize it, not just because of nuclear ban, but because we have two people right now, two racists, two white nationalist authoritarians with 90% of the world's nuclear weapons in Putin and in Trump. There is no, and then you have over 130 countries that are mostly non-white in the UN trying to ban the bomb. There's no bigger connection of race and nuclear weapons than right now. And so what we need to do, thank you. And so let me just say that when we step back and we look at intersectionality and we look at all of these movements, we'll realize how so many people before us did, most notably Malcolm X, who probably understood it best. That for all of us and all of these different movements, the issue is, was, and remains truly so that all of us have universal human rights. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Vincent. I just want to remind us that the title of this conference is One Struggle, Many Fronts. No nukes, no war, no walls, no warming. And so our final speaker on this panel is my colleague, Andrew Lichterman. He is a policy analyst and lawyer with the Western States Legal Foundation in Oakland. As a lawyer, he has represented peace and environmental activists in a variety of settings and also taught at alternative law schools for many years. In recent years, his work has focused on the purposes and impacts of U.S. nuclear and other strategic weapons programs, including their effect on global disarmament efforts and on the relationship between nuclear technologies, militarism, and the global economy. He's a member of the board of the International Association of Lawyers Against Nuclear Arms, the Coordinating Committee of United for Peace and Justice, and the Global Council of Abolition. So, Andy.
How far up? Okay, yes.
Thanks. Well, that quote that Jackie read from is actually from a little leaflet we put together on the relationship between nuclear weapons and climate change. And it was paired up with another quote, which was one from Lewis Mumford in 1970. Is the association of inordinate power and productivity with equally inordinate violence and destruction a purely accidental one? And I think the speakers in our first panel eloquently provided us the answer to that question. And I would also note that in 1970, Mumford was writing from within the context of deep, sustained, and diverse social movements, the kind of moment that Vincent was describing, and I'll come back to that theme later today. So a number of us who are here now had an interesting discussion in Vienna at the NPT Preparatory Committee meetings about obstacles and opportunities for disarmament. And I'm going to try to continue that theme a little bit there in the context of how we might forge connections with other emerging movements, and also at the same time to provide some background for this afternoon's last panel, which will look at what comes next after a ban treaty has been negotiated. And my thoughts, of course, are very strongly influenced by my experience here in the United States, but conditions in the United States also, unfortunately, still play a disproportionate role due to its place at the apex of the global economy and the global war system. Now, the ban treaty effort, together with the conferences on humanitarian impacts that preceded it, constitutes an important affirmation of the norms against nuclear weapons possession and use. These initiatives raised awareness in a new generation of activists of the catastrophic effects of nuclear warfare. If a ban treaty is successfully negotiated, which appears likely, it will provide new ways for nuclear weapons-free governments to exert pressure on the nuclear-armed states. And it also could provide new opportunities for raising public awareness about the dangers that nuclear weapons pose. But so far, the humanitarian conferences on the effects of nuclear weapons and the ban treaty process have not sparked mass movements for disarmament in the nuclear-armed states or their leading allies. And the main obstacles for disarmament, as Sharon noted, are unsurprisingly the intransigence of those nuclear armed states, sustained by the inertia of their entangled antagonisms and the economic and political power of their military-industrial complexes. And it's important to keep in mind that a convention banning nuclear weapons will bind only the countries that join it. And so far, these nuclear armed states and their allies have stood strongly in opposition. But almost half the world's population lives in nuclear-armed countries. These countries account for over half of the world's gross domestic product. And the 6 leading countries that have military alliances with the nuclear-armed United States, Germany, Italy, Canada, Australia, Japan, South Korea, and you have over half the world's population, accounting for 70% of global GDP. And in an era of renewed and more multipolar and complex great power competitions, the leading militaries now claim a variety of roles for their nuclear weapons. The nuclear-armed military-industrial complexes, having survived their own post-Cold War ideological crisis, have helped to sustain a highly inequitable global circulation of trade and investment and constitute a significant source of profit and a center of economic and political power within it. So again, if a convention is negotiated, which it most likely will be, it can provide us a new tool to work for nuclear weapons abolition. But it can be no stronger than the hands that wield it. And for there to be substantial progress towards nuclear abolition, we will need mass movements in the nuclear-armed countries. Large-scale opposition here in the United States is likely to come about only as a part of a broader peace movement, one that, as many people have commented today, can work together with other emerging movements by focusing on the common causes of the dangers and injustices they seek to end. A renewed effort to understand and explain the dynamics driving the growing risk of war among nuclear-armed countries in this movement is an essential starting point. It's the path to starting to make the connections to other issues, from wealth and income inequality to the damage wrought to the environment by an economy dependent on endless competition and endless material growth. Now, amidst a generally grim political landscape, there are some glimpses now of how things might be able to move in this direction. We seem to be coming out of a period of about 3 decades of low social mobilization. This period has been characterized by also what Vincent was talking about: single-issue, professionalized, interest group advocacy-style politics. Times of low social mobilization lead to a kind of self-reinforcing stagnation. Low rates of political involvement tend towards the proliferation of these single-issue organizations, employing professionals who use conventional campaigning techniques and litigation. Conventional professionals focus on effects rather than causes, offering incremental technical, legal, and short-term political fixes for the problems that the dominant order of things systematically generates. Proposing any policy change that would significantly affect the current distribution of wealth and power lies beyond the ambit of the reasonable and the fundable professional course of activity. And in times of low social mobilization, proposals that would require fundamental social change do appear unreasonable, as only deep, broad, sustained social movements can change the boundaries of what is politically possible. And, in this respect, the ban treaty is interesting to think about, because it may be close to the outer limits of what you can do in disarmament work in a time of low social mobilization. It developed an international network of NGOs employing skilled and dedicated campaigners with the support of some friendly governments. It helped to spark a series of high-profile international conferences on the consequences of nuclear warfare. But notably, these conferences focused mainly on the effects of nuclear weapons and not on the causes of continued high-tech militarism and renewed confrontations among nuclear-armed powers. Give me a moment, I'm fighting a bit of a bug here, so it's keeping my voice going is a bit of a struggle. Now, this kind of approach was sufficient to gain the backings of governments in nuclear weapons-free countries. But without a far broader basis for social support, it's extremely difficult to make real disarmament progress in countries where nuclear weapons play a systemic role in military policies, national security ideologies, and increasingly insular, top-tier national economies. Now, in retrospect, we can see that the Ban Treaty Initiative started in a very different moment. The episodic waves of resistance sparked by the global crisis of 2007 to 2008 and the distinctly inhumane response of most of the Western governments mostly still lay in the future. So too did the accelerating tensions among the nuclear-armed great powers, particularly the renewed confrontations in Northeast Asia and in Europe, although some already were warning then of that danger. But as recently as 2012, President Obama and many of the leading arms controllers could, with a straight face, rank the acquisition of nuclear weapons by terrorists as a greater threat to humanity than the civilization-destroying arsenals of the nuclear-armed states. Now, since that time, waves of resistance have coalesced into the collapse of the established political alignment and party structures of several of the Western nuclear-armed countries. The first to take advantage of this interregnum have been authoritarian nationalist forces, privileging a single, usually racial and religious vision of what the nation is and who is a legitimate member of that nation. So our starting point for making common cause with the movements for a more democratic, fair, and ecologically sustainable global society will be understanding the relationship between these developments: the rising risk of war among nuclear-armed states, the ascendance of these authoritarian nationalisms, and the deepening discontent engendered worldwide by the accelerating polarization of wealth and income. And although the initial beneficiary of this interregnum has been these authoritarian nationalist forces, their rise is also a marker of a return to higher levels of social mobilization, and by stoking resistance across the rest of society, they likely also have helped to accelerate it. Now, again, in times of high social mobilization, such as those that Vincent was describing, these great waves of movements that gained momentum in the late 1950s here in the US and then subsided in the 80s, the connections among issues and struggles are easier to see. The mass movements of such times provide the independent spaces and social and material to support, to explore and develop them. And the best thinkers of such moments could distill these connections with an admirable clarity. Now, I'm about to read one of my favorite, lesser-known Martin Luther King quotes. And I want to do a little exercise, sort of pull back for a moment. And, I'm doing my best, but contrast the density and complexity of the kind of discussion, and I'm not saying that in a good sense, I'm saying that in a bad sense, of my discussion with the clarity of the way that King makes these connections. Now, of course, one always compares one's own words with Dr. King's at one's own peril. But I think it helps to contrast the difficulty of understanding our murky moment from where we're sitting to how one can understand their moment from long immersion within the perspective of broad and sustained social movements. So in 1967, Dr. King told us that we must honestly face the fact that the movement must address itself to the question of restructuring of the whole of American society. And he went on to say, a nation that will keep people in slavery for 244 years will thingify them, make them things. Therefore, they will exploit them, and poor people generally, economically. And a nation that will exploit economically will have foreign investments and everything else, and will have to use its military to protect them. All of these problems are tied together. If we are to create the broad movements that might make disarmament possible, we must be able to explain that nuclear weapons are neither a Cold War anachronism nor an inexplicable aberration. They are not an effect without a cause, but rather the ultimate expression of a system heedless of our place in nature and in which the few profit from endless competition and conflict while all the world bears the risk. Thanks.
So I want to thank Andy and Vincent and Sharon for 3 very interesting presentations. And now we will take some questions and answers before taking a break. So can I see the hands of people who have questions? Everybody has been stunned into silence. Huh? Joanne? Anybody else? Ellen? Okay. Well, all right, I see Dave and Ariel. So let's start with those. So Joanne, do you want to come up here so we can hear your question? No.
Don't you think in a sense our governments have been the witness to us keeping us apart? Today is a perfect example. There were maybe 6 of us that actually look like me that you can see in the audience. And is it not fear that they have created so that we don't come together and so that we don't speak out and that we're afraid to speak out? We are taking this as communists or we're taking it with all these labels and so we don't come together. How can we make a difference as people in the peace movement for everybody to come here? There are only maybe 6 of us that you can actually tell, and the Asian people and people who they drop bombs on all the time, people of color. How do we make that difference? The lady asked, how do we come together? How do we make them realize that we are human too? Your mic's not working.
Oh.
And not the greed of capitalism or governments.
Okay, thank you, Joanne. Thank you, Joanne. Thank you for your passion also. Ellen?
Yes, I just have a simple question for our first speaker. She was asking about, and I'd like to know if there are any websites that people can go to.
Okay, we'll take the questions first, okay? Thanks. We'll take the questions first and then ask for answers. Dave Webb?
Thanks. I'll take this because I'm not very good at shouting. Thank you very much for your presentations. They were all brilliant, wonderful things. I just wondered if you had any comment on, in Britain we have now a possible Prime Minister in the making, Jeremy Corbyn, who has brought a lot of these issues together himself and campaigned on these issues, and he's winning huge support. Do you think, should he become Prime Minister, which he may well do soon, that will make a lot of difference to the campaign globally? Because we are told time and again by our ambassadors and so on, Britain getting rid of its nuclear weapons won't make any difference. We feel it will, but I'd like to hear your opinion. Thanks.
Thanks. And we have one more question from Ariel.
I want to thank you first very much because you open doors, and I think that's what we need, and bring all these movements together. So my question is really on the line of Dave, because I come from abroad, so I would like to know how we can unite also at the international level, because we feel, at least from Europe, that your fight is, exciting or enlightening ours when you are in the streets against Trump or when you mobilize again for climate change, and we feel that everything is still going on, and so how does it interfere when we in Europe do things? And I would like to know, apart from the great Abolition 2000 network, how we can do more together.
Okay, thanks. So we had Joanne's in. Yeah, I will. Okay. All right, so I just want to, so I'm going to ask each speaker to respond, but I would like to give the microphone to Sharon first, since her time was inadvertently shortened, and ask her to answer Ellen's question about how we all can help you.
Well, thanks. Great question. Love to have help. Well, but first I would like to answer the question if Jeremy Corbyn as the Prime Minister will make a difference. And the question is, hell yeah. I mean, a Prime Minister of a nuclear-armed state that said in his campaign, in his initial campaign, I will not push the button. And people treated him as if he was crazy because he said the most sane thing in the world. And the other guy, the Prime Minister, I forgot his name, thank God, said, I will push the button as an answer, which is the most crazy, insane thing to say. So having someone like that becoming the Prime Minister makes, I think, it will make waves around the world. Definitely if he'll start working on it. So let's hope and pray that it will happen. And it's almost impossible that it will happen. So yeah, great parties around the world. You asked if there was, if there is a website. So yes, it's called Israeli Disarmament Movement. No, sorry, www.disarmament.org.il. It's not being updated much. We also have a Facebook page, Israeli Disarmament Movement, and my Facebook page. And how people can help. Well, first, and it's a bit embarrassing to say, we always look for funds. If you have any ideas of how we can fund for our activities, we have great activities. For example, we just took our Prime Minister to court alongside with the Atomic Agency Commission. They said we will never see our day in court, that the court will bury it. But in September we're going to make history, and the Supreme Court is going to discuss for the first time our nuclear program. It didn't make us very popular, I can tell you that, but it did make us extremely, extremely happy. When it comes to the draft treaty, we're always in a look for places for people from the Middle East to meet. People from the Middle East cannot meet in the Middle East. It's complicated, but just trust my word. The Arab states will not see Israelis inside the Middle East. It has to be outside. So the Scottish CND offered to approach their government, and they're going to host one meeting. But any place is also good. We need to meet, we need to talk, so we can push our zone into any progress. And the last thing I want to say, because I didn't say it before, one of the biggest issues is what should happen first, peace or disarmament. And of course the governments in the Middle East would like to see either peace first and then we can talk, or Israel should first get rid of its nuclear weapons and then we can talk. But the point is that it doesn't matter what happened first. Because peace is not visible right now, not with the current government, then it's up to us to push for disarmament for two main reasons. In this region, no one should be able to put its hands on weapons of mass destruction. There are no responsible states in the region, especially not states that possess weapons of mass destruction. If a state invests in nuclear weapon, it's not a responsible state. But you can already see it with Syria. When in the US, Obama was talking about the danger of WMD falling into non-state actors, already chemical weapons fell into the hands of ISIS. If we had these talks, this treaty 5 years ago, there wouldn't be any chemical weapons to fall in the hands of ISIS. How come they don't say it? It's surprising. Talking about disarmament in this environment will increase the chance for peace. And that's extremely important for us. Not to fall into this, but to keep pushing the Middle East to disarm, because that might make everything else fall into place. Thanks.
Answer anything you want.
Joanne, to get back to your question, a couple things. So the obvious is yes, the government has divided and conquered poor whites from African Americans in different groups and left and progressive groups. Yes, it's all been calculated, that's been done. It was calculated to separate African from African Americans throughout our history, so that's obviously the case, right? So with that being said, then how do you get more diverse voices? How do you get more people of color into the disarmament movement? Again, something I'm so focused on. Again, it's hard because even for me, how do I tell my students who are struggling? How do I tell my undocumented students that are worried about ICE breaking down their door, oh, by the way, now today go to the disarmament rally and care about this issue? How do I tell my Muslim students that are dealing with hate crimes and fearing for their lives, can't even go home on a spring break, don't know if they get back in the country, oh, by the way, this nuclear ban is going on? So I get it. But that said, how do you get them to realize that these issues are connected? And so when we look at things, when you talk to younger folks today, you talk to people on the street, you talk about $1 trillion being spent on nuclear weapons. What does $1 trillion even mean? It's so abstract. It's such a number we can't even wrap our heads around, right? But economic conversion was really important and worked well in the 1980s. So how could we reuse it again, especially in terms of poor black communities? Well, because you have to actually go in those communities. You have to go in a place like East Baltimore. And if you could show them where money that would be taken out of nuclear weapons could actually go to infrastructure and education programs, if you could get members of the Congressional Black Caucus, if you can get mayors and governors to buy into something like this, then that changes things, right? Don't forget that the Congressional Black Caucus for many years was at the forefront of this fight. It was John Conyers, it was Ron Dellums. I mean, we had members that were, so where have they gone? Why are we not pressuring the Congressional Black Caucus right now to get more involved in something like this? The thing with the nuclear weapons ban, which I know we're going to talk about later, is, in some ways, it's simplicity. Right? You start talking to kids or people that aren't educated about NPT and CTB, they're gone, forget it. Like the thing with nuclear weapons ban treaty was very simple, that we want to ban nuclear weapons, a legal framework, period. That's what I think the climate change movement did so well to try to get not so many diverse voices in. They knew they needed one thing, one simplistic thing to rally around, especially youth. What was it? Keystone. We knew Keystone Pipeline wasn't the be-all, end-all of environmental racism, but it was something they could see, it was tangible, a fight they could get behind. And that's how I see the nuclear weapons ban treaty, something that they can actually get behind. I will. So the other piece, obviously, as a teacher, I'm a big proponent of educating and how do you get this into the educational systems. I was just at MIT where we were working with how do we get nuclear disarmament lectures into more Black studies programs, into more Latino studies programs. So I think you start there with education. And lastly, because I know we got to go, is capitalizing on where we're at right now with Trump, right? That we haven't had this kind of talk about nuclear weapons since the 1980s. We are seeing numbers and movements like never before. So again, tying this man's disgusting racism to having his finger on the button is something we cannot lose focus of.
I really want to just follow up with an illustration of a point that Vincent made, which was the one about showing up for other people's struggles. Now, I want to preface this by saying, we at Western States Legal Foundation are sort of the equivalent in these issues of born on third base and thought we hit a triple, because we live in the community and a community in a congressional district that has a long tradition of strong African American political leadership that also has been strongly for peace, like, for example, Ron Dellums, who Vincent and Intondi just mentioned. And I also want to illustrate at the same time the way these things work and work better during these times of high social mobilization. In the 1980s, we were one of the two sets of lawyers and organizers really for a big multi-organization struggle to keep Reagan and his Navy from homeporting a whole bunch of nuclear-armed ships in the San Francisco Bay Area. And, we got all kinds of organizations to sign on, but first of all, it took about 2 years of walking around and talking to people and going back and going back and going back. And I was also, for example, in the Livermore Action Group Legal Collective, which was the collective of lawyers who provided legal support for the direct action-oriented protesters at nuclear weapons facilities. But we also showed up for other people's protests and legal observed for those protests as well. You show up, and you show up again, and you show up again. And, you know, we would not have succeeded, we wouldn't have come close to succeeding in the campaign, which was successful. They didn't put the ships in the bay without this integration of all of these communities and the African American political leadership from the city council level right up to Ron Dellins, who was chair of the Military Facilities and Installations Committee of the Armed Services Committee, and arguably one of the most effective, not just eloquent, but effective anti-war and anti-militarism voices in Congress in the 1980s and early 1990s.
So thanks everybody for hanging in there, for your patience. I just want to say something to sum up this whole discussion. It came to me, a quote from Joseph Rotblat, who was the only physicist to quit the Manhattan Project for moral reasons. And he said, "Remember your humanity and forget the rest." And I kind of think that sums up this discussion. So we're going to take a break now. I am happy to tell you there are some refreshments available downstairs. I invite you to go down, pick something up to eat and drink, and please come back here in, I'm going to say 10 minutes. I know it'll be longer than that, but come back here at 3:35 if you can, and we'll get started with the last two panels.